the session, and I hope you're doing well during this crisis caused by COVID-19 pandemic. Can you summarize what you and your team found in 2019, a year prior to the comprehensive lockdown that we suffer from?
Yeah, sure. We had two principal objectives for the 2019 season. First of all, we were at Wisad Pools, where we'd been for 2 years previously. Well, actually, we'd been Wisad Pools ever since 2011, but we alternate very often between Wisad Pools and the Wadi of Qattafi, where those basalt mesas are. So in 2018 and 2019, we were back at Wisad Pools. Wisad Pools has a long occupation history beginning roughly at 6,500 BC, but continuing well into the Bronze Age, although the occupations after, let's say, after 5,000 BC aren't really occupations. They're building tombs, they're building some kind of communal buildings, maybe associated with religion, but we don't think there were any houses. Well, at Wisad Pools, building number W80 was fairly large, about between 6 and 7 meters in diameter, and it had a lot of sort of details that were very strange compared to most late Neolithic structures. It had, for example, a walled courtyard on one side. It had two rooms. Let me start that over. It had 2 doors. The interior of the building had been renovated at least 3 times. There was a nice standing stone in the middle of the building that we suspect may have had more of a ritual purpose rather than to support the roof. And as we were finishing the 2018 season, within the last 2 or 3 days, we took a probe down relatively rapidly, hoping to get to sort of natural soil, not archaeological. Mm-hmm. But in those last 2 or 3 days, bam, we hit another floor. And the floor was made of basalt slabs that weren't from immediately around the house. In fact, the closest we could see where that material was coming from was a quarry about 200 meters downhill. Now, these slabs weigh probably 50 kilograms, maybe 75 kilograms. Yeah. And so they were bringing this stuff uphill for some strange reason. And this floor went under all of the walls that, all the walls of the building that we had been excavating for several years. So in 2019, we continued to excavate and expose more of that floor. And we're still not convinced that we've hit sterile soil. So we've got something a little bit older probably than 6,500 BC, but we don't know how much older. Now, the other end of the late Neolithic, which ends around 5,000 BC, we've got an area of Wisad Pools that has, now I'll just, I'm going to make a guess here, that around 15 houses, very small, probably not more than 3 meters in maximum dimension. And they're attached to animal pens. And this is very characteristic of that period, let's say between 5,500 to 5,000 BC. So we began excavating there in 2018 and continued in 2019. And these little houses are really interesting. And they are small, but they also have standing stones, probably smaller families, or they could belong simply to a shepherd. I don't know. We don't know yet.
Yeah, it's a matter of speculation.
Yeah. So we wanted then in 2020, 2020, we wanted to finish both of those buildings and maybe go on to another kind of building, because we still have what look like a lot of ritual structures out there. We haven't even taken a single stone away. So that was about it. We got nailed by COVID-19 and couldn't continue.
Regarding shrines that you found,
Yeah.
do we have any idea about the religious life of people who lived in the black basalt desert?
No. Well, we don't have any burials. So that's one thing that's really missing. We have little caches, little clusters of animal bones, especially the sort of the knuckle bones of gazelle. We had the burial, it looks like a burial, of parts of a wild donkey, wild ass, or onager, I guess is what it is, in this W80, this large building W80. We also had some artifacts, some sort of ornaments, like a plaque made of mother of pearl. And these ornaments kind of tended to be against the wall, where the wall meets the floors. So this kind of indicates a little bit that they have a special function inside the house. They weren't necessarily wearing these ornaments, but they're there for some reason. But other than that, there's really not very much in the way of ritual evidence that we can date. That's the problem. Wisad Pools has got structures all over the place. We've got standing stones all by themselves without a building around it. But that's going to be almost impossible to date. So is this late Neolithic, or is it Chalcolithic, or is it early Bronze Age? So these are all things that we really don't know.
Regarding Wisad Pools, that area is also well known for its desert kites. Can you elaborate more about desert kites, which are typical for Neolithic period? And it's not only present in Arabian desert and Black Desert, but there's some finds in Armenia and Central Asia.
Yeah, these kites, people have wondered what the heck the kites were used for. Back in the 1940s, they thought these were simply places for shepherds to keep their animals, protect them from wolves or lions or whatever it was.
Of course.
But now it is crystal clear that these are hunting traps. And there's a lot of kites around Wisad Pools, a lot of kites in the Wadi al-Qattafi. And these kites were probably the main focus out there. Now, these guys also had sheep and goats, but only about 10% of the bones, maybe even less, are from sheep and goats. At least half of the bones are gazelle, and then you get a bunch of mixed species like hare and fox. So we think probably these guys were keeping sheep and goats for dairy products, especially milk that would be changed into yogurt, because you can preserve yogurt for a long time. But most of their activity was probably associated with, number one, building kites, which took an awful long time. It may have, if you had a team of 10 adults, there's a German geologist named Stefan, I can't remember his last name, who has calculated that it would take a team of about 10 people up to 80 days to build one kite with an app. You know, kites have these long guiding walls that sort of force the animals into the final enclosure. So with an average of about 3 kilometers or 4 kilometers for each of these two guiding walls, they could build then a kite in around 80 days, maybe even a little bit less. And that would be for the rainy season. You know, that's about how long the rainy season lasts. But there are thousands of, well, there are 1,400 kites in the Black Desert itself. Now, in Jordan's Black Desert.
Yeah.
There's more in Syria and more in Saudi. And not all of them were necessarily built in the late Neolithic. I mean, they may have been building them also in the Chalco early Bronze. And we know that the earliest kites were in probably the end of the late PPNB, the beginning of the PPNC. You know Wa'il Abu Aziza? He's a Palestinian who got his PhD out of France. And he excavated a site down in the Jaffa Basin. And he's got, I don't know, like 10 dates right at 7,000 BC, right at the end of the late PPNB, the beginning of the PPNC. And in a pit of bones, they were able to identify a minimum of 149 gazelle. All, you know, I mean, that's what these kites are for, mass killing, mass slaughter. And so he's got the best evidence we've got for when this began and why they're building those kites. We'd like to be able to excavate some kites too, especially in Wadi al-Qattafi, because they're right next to our campsite. We don't have to drive out very far at all. But it takes a long time. And all we're finding out is about kites. We're not finding out too much about the people. And so we haven't really decided that we're going to expand what we're going to research.
Did you cooperate with the Global Kites project?
No.
Which Remy Clessard is involved with. I had the opportunity to talk to him and publish some articles about his research. Remy Clessard and his team operates.
Yeah, when he started the Global Kites project, he was going from Armenia all the way down to.
He operates in Saudi Arabia and Oman as well.
Yeah, he's done some really great work, but we hadn't expressed any interest in kites, and I think he did some work in the Safawi area, but I'm not sure about that. In northern Jordan. But he and I, we correspond a lot now. Especially since he's begun this new project, or will begin this new project, at the Khaybar Oasis in, what's the name of the province? Well, it's in the Nafud Desert.
Okay,
he's
so
beginning
another project in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and it's a big one. It's huge.
There are lots of teams who are planning to operate in Saudi Arabia in coming months and coming years. depending on what's going on with COVID-19. And
Yeah,
I heard that French teens are particularly active.
yeah.
And regarding the Black Desert in Jordan, what we can conclude by studying inscriptions that were found in the Black Desert? Your team also analyzed different inscriptions
Yeah,
that were found there.
yeah. We've published a couple of articles. We published one way back in 2010 or something. I don't remember. In a journal that no longer exists. But one of the things about the animals that are depicted on the rock art is that it gives you a clue of what the environment was like when they're making this rock art. And from the different animal species we have represented, it looks like you're in East Africa. I mean, there's kudu, oryx, of course. Well, I mean, there's just a variety of animals that are very similar to East Africa. It doesn't look anything like today's Black Desert, because there's no vegetation out there at all anymore. So that's one thing you can do. But also, we've got a lot of, at Wisad pools, we've got a lot of material that shows kites. And in fact, we've got one kite depiction that's actually got a little animal in the middle of it. So it kind of gives us a visual impact of what people were doing at that time. For inscriptions that are written language, we have a lot of Safavidic inscriptions that Omar Ghul has just published, or it's in the process of being published. And he's got one inscription that's, I think, 7 or 8 lines long, in tiny little letters as well. So I think it's one of the longest Safavidic inscriptions. But like so much of the Safavidic inscriptions, it's sort of a genealogy. You know, Ahmad, son of Muhammad, son of so-and-so and so-and-so. But it does give tribal names. And he's found a new tribe, I think. He's found a new tribe out there now that would date to 400 BC to 400 AD, I guess.
So we have the evidence of concrete people living in the Black Desert by analyzing these inscriptions.
Yeah, and it also, it really struck me when I began, because I didn't know anything about, I still don't know very much about Bedouin.
Yeah.
But I mean, these guys are kind of like Bedouin, very, very similar, but they're all literate, or at least some of the people are literate. You don't see very much from 19th century Bedouin camps or anything that they're writing. You have to learn that in a school. So these Safavidics seem to have been, at least some of them, pretty nicely educated.
True.
Yeah.
So how climate change affected the societal shifts in the area of Eastern Jordan, or particularly in the Black Desert?
The Black Desert really suffered during the Bronze Age. During the late Neolithic and even earlier, there was a lot more rainfall than today, maybe even twice as much rainfall in Western Jordan and in Eastern Jordan. And that would mean at times in the Black Desert, there may have been occasionally enough rain for a crop to grow, like barley, something that doesn't require a lot of water. We know that there was a lot of water out there because we've got pollen from one of the Qas out there that has bulrushes, or cattails, which are marsh plants. We also have pollen from a tiny little leaf plant that's about the size of your little fingernail. And this is called duckweed, and that requires a marsh, standing water. We've got charcoal from a fig, a fruit. We've got charcoal of that, of the fruit itself, not the tree, but the fruit. We've got charcoal from oak trees, and they, the oak trees provide all these acorns, which are in fact very nutritious if you can get rid of that bitter material in it. And if you've got water out there, you can just soak all of the tannic acid out, and you can use it sort of like flour, like, you crush it up and you can make bread, acorn bread out of it. And willow, we have a piece of charcoal from a willow branch, and willows have to have water too, standing water. So it was very different from what we see today. Now, beginning probably in the Chalcolithic, people changed from relying on the hunting of gazelle and the kites to becoming more or less herders rather than hunter herders. And it was now an industrial herding, sort of like we would see in the 19th century among the Bedouin. That increased the amount of sheep and goat traffic, and they have these hooves that are just like chisels. And one of the things that happens, if rain decreases to the point where, all of the plants die during a drought, let's say for 10 or 15 or 20 years, those little hoofs are digging up the topsoil, the crust on top of it. And that opens up the loss of all of the soil to the wind. So a lot of the soil that we used to have out there during the late Neolithic, which was about 35 to 40 centimeters of just superb dirt, that now gets blown into Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and it just exposes everything to the basalt. Now, if the droughts hadn't lasted too long, the desert might have been able to recover. But at around, I think, 3,300 to 3,500 BC, there was almost no rainfall at all for a long time. And from that, there was no recovery. And that's what you see out there today. So it was a combination of climate change and an increase in terms of herding density and intensity. And that's what, in my mind, that's what brought on that sort of lunar landscape that we see today.
So the heydays of the Black Desert occurred between 6,500 and 5,000 BC. Or let's say that period witnessed the increase of the population in that area.
Yeah, in fact, I've just written an article, it won't probably be published until next year, that I call The Crowded Desert. And I think it's called The Crowded Desert, the Late Neolithic Black Desert Megasites in the Late Neolithic Black Desert. And this really was, that 1,500 year period was an immense growth of population. Now, these people didn't all live together. We've got something like 600 houses in the mesas in the Wadi al Qattafi. And I'm not saying that all 600 houses were occupied at the same time. But I suspect that a lot of them were, that at some seasons, or one of the seasons, people would come in from outside the Wadi itself and sort of aggregate for maybe the entire summer.
Mhm.
And then in the winter, they would go out hunting gazelle, building kites. And then because there was so much water, they would come back to the Wadi al-Qattafi, they come back to Wisad pools and spend the summer until the rainy season started again. And then they would go.
Yeah, they'll spread around.
Yeah. And essentially, that's what the Safavidics were doing. Safavidic inscriptions tend to be concentrated along the eastern edge of the Black Desert or the western edge of the Black Desert. And in the inscriptions that Michael McDonald studied way back in the 80s, the Safavidic inscriptions indicated that these tribal concentrations during the rainy season were on the edges of the Black Desert, so that once the rain started falling, they could take their sheep and goats out immediately. And then after the rainy season was over, there's nothing out there.
Yeah.
So then they would come back to the Black Desert. The Black Desert, by the way, has an awful lot of microhabitats that the limestone area, the Hamad, not very much in terms of different kinds of resources at different times of the year. But Wisad Pool or the Black Desert's got a lot of variability. And that makes it easier to spend a longer amount of time than today.
Can you compare the Black Desert of that period with Jericho, which was another well-known settled site? Some would say the oldest site in the history, which is debatable. We don't know probably with 100% conviction which site is the oldest in the world, but
yeah, well, I mean, Jericho, the oldest part of Jericho is around 11,000 BC, something like that. But it was a camp. It wasn't a town. It wasn't, people were there on a seasonal basis.
Of course.
And it doesn't become really settled until the PPNA at about 9,500 BC. Ain Ghazal, for example, doesn't get settled until 8,400 BC. So Jericho is older, but it also didn't last very long. Or I should say, there's 1,000 years missing at Jericho. And that's what we found at Ain Ghazal. We found those 1,000 years, the PPNC and, the late PPNB and the PPNC. That was missing from Jericho. Yeah. Jericho was reoccupied at the beginning of the Pottery Neolithic. And they had a very special style. The decorations on what's called Jericho 9 shows up for the first time at Jericho at about 6,500 BC. In Jordan, there's pottery also at 6,500, but it's a completely different set of people. The decoration is very different. And it's kind of like, going to Germany and then taking a trip to England or something.
Yeah.
You can see big differences in styles and stuff. So yeah, we had, I think, 2 different cultures during the late Neolithic from 6,500 on.
Can we talk about the migration from areas like Jericho eastwards and vice versa?
Yeah.
Do we have evidence that same
just
people
outside
were?
of Jerusalem.
Yeah. Do we have evidence that same people were migrating from West Bank to East Bank and the Black Desert?
No, we don't have that kind of
Yeah.
information, especially in the Black Desert, because we don't have any pottery out there.
Mhm.
But beginning at about 7,400, 7,500, we had the first of a really sharp, severe drop in rainfall, right at the end of the middle PPNB period. Jericho was still occupied, Ain Ghazal was occupied. I mean, this was the general condition for all the way from Syria down to Aqaba and into the Negev. But at 7,500, there was this sharp drop that didn't last very long. It only lasted maybe 100 years. But that seems to have ended all of the permanent occupation of middle PPNB people in Jericho, in all of the West Bank. And it looks like, well, at that time, Ain Ghazal suddenly doubles in population. And at that time, Basta is built for the first time. And it is a megasite like Ain Ghazal. We had all of these populations suddenly popping up like mushrooms in the Jordanian highlands, and there's almost no activity in the West Bank at all. Now that it looks as if that's a reaction to climate change. That in the West Bank, there had been over-exploitation of the vegetation that led to the end of animal herding because there wasn't any vegetation for them to eat, that they couldn't produce enough food by farming. So they came up to the highlands of Jordan, and that lasted for 500 years, from 7,500 to around 7,000. But now put this in perspective. Suddenly we've got the population of the highlands like it was, the migrations coming out of some war area. And it wasn't war, it was just people starving to death. But this puts a huge amount of pressure on the local resources in highland Jordan around permanent sources of water, like springs. It lasted for 500 years, so it was pretty successful. But eventually, these guys are just destroying the countryside. There's not much left. And so at about 7,000 BC, there's another one of these sharp drops in rainfall. And again, probably lasting for 50 to 100 years. And that kills the megasites. Suddenly, we get the migration back again towards the West Bank. Now, there's a new site just outside of Jerusalem called Motza.
Okay.
Where they've been excavating for the last 5 years. And it's got the first megasite in the West Bank. And it's huge. It's twice the size of Ain Ghazal. And it's all PPNC, except they call it final PPNB. I don't know why, but it's contemporary with PPNC Ain Ghazal. And other sites, smaller ones, I mean, much smaller, sort of like maybe 500 people or so, start popping up all over the West Bank. And so, yeah, there is good migration. I mean, the only way you can explain the sudden increase in the megasites and then the sudden abandonment or depopulation, actually, is that we've got people moving, back and forth.
Regarding Ain Ghazal, around 7,000 BC, we had the similar trend, but towards the Black Desert.
Yeah, we think when you look at the number, there are, I think, 10 or 11 megasites in Jordan. and they had around 20,000 altogether, put all the population together. That's like 20 to 24,000 people who suddenly have to leave because they can't farm anymore. Now, I don't know how many of those 20,000 people go to the West Bank. And I don't know how many are going to the Black Desert. Certainly the Black Desert could have handled a lot of people, but whether it's 10,000 that came out there, which I doubt, or it's only 3,000 of those 20,000 go out to the Black Desert. That's a large concentration of people that the Black Desert never saw before. And in part, if they are moving to the Black Desert, they're being drawn by this gazelle hunting phenomenon, where they're probably trading meat, but also gazelle hides with the people who are still farming in the PPNC in Western Jordan and on the West Bank as well. So it looks like maybe we've got a new industry has come up because of the kite hunting.
For Jordan, how Ain Ghazal was important? What's the importance of Ain Ghazal as a site from the Neolithic period? You spent many seasons there, and you've been operating at Ain Ghazal from 1982, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
You started in 1980 in Azak.
Yeah.
And then you moved to work in Ain Ghazal, and that was the major discovery back then, and still it's very significant site.
Yeah, Ain Ghazal was the first site. Ain Ghazal was the first mega site, and or the first one that was found, excavated. And it was difficult to convince people that it really was a mega site, that the entire site was being occupied at the same time, that it wasn't just one village sort of moving around every 10 generations or every 5 generations. But what it showed was that there were a lot of resources up in Jordan that allowed that kind of development to take place. Now, when we began work at Ain Ghazal, we concentrated on the middle PPNB because that's what had been exposed by the highway that they built through the edge of the site. It wasn't until 1984 that we moved in away from the highway, moved into the interior of the site, that we found the PPNC. And when we saw that this had been expanding through the late PPNB into the PPNC, that we knew that we had a large concentrated population. And then Gable down in Basta found the same thing at Basta. Who else? Maysoon has got a mega site up at Tel Abu Suwan. The Spaniards have got this enormous mega site now called Haraisin that I don't know if it was abandoned at the end of 7000 BC or if there is a continuation. They haven't published very much recently. But I mean, Ain Ghazal was simply the first understanding that there could be very large concentrated populations. And it was, in fact, an adaptation for the population of the southern Levant as a whole. We can't say that Ain Ghazal was a capital because it wasn't. There is no political organization, but there was a lot of social organization change. If you've got a village with 800 people and suddenly you've got a village with 1,600 people, the old way of taking care of disputes, the old way of who do you marry, the old way of how do you assign farmland, that all had to change. And so there was a major, it's not political, but there was a major social, economic,
Yeah.
and we see that all over in the megasites.
Regarding the pottery from Ain Ghazal, what kind of conclusions we can draw
From the pottery?
from the pottery? Yeah, because your team worked with the pottery in Ain Ghazal.
Well, Zidane would be a better person to ask about the pottery because he was the pottery analyst for the entire period. But I mean, the pottery was actually pretty well made. It's very thick compared to Iron Age or, well, late Bronze Age or whatever. And we didn't find very much in terms of pottery kilns. There's one kiln area up across the Zarqa River from the main site, way up near where the caves are. And that seemed to be a central pottery kiln. But on the main site, we didn't really find anything like that at all. It might be that there are several kilns for the Yarmoukhian period, but we just didn't find them.
But you found, I think, 151 figurines that were a kind of children's toys, and they were also used by inhabitants of Ain Ghazal to bring luck during hunting season, or probably to bring luck in their personal life. What do we know about these figurines, which are, of course, well known worldwide after 1980?
Well, the small animal figurines probably had two reasons. One, they probably were being made for children on the one hand, and in fact, they could have been made by children on the other hand. But there are some that have, certainly they have some kind of ritual meaning. Luck in the hunt, probably. Because at that time, even though, in the middle PPNB, they had domesticated goats, but they were also, half of the meat they were eating was coming from hunting. And so there was a major sort of concern about making certain that the animals were around, that you could trap them, you could hunt them. For human figurines, here we're probably looking mostly at ritual meaning. Not that they are spirits, not that they are gods, but that they had some kind of power. Probably the most interesting human figurines are the ones of pregnant ladies, with huge stomachs, big breasts. On the back of a couple of them, you could see that it had been smoothed, probably from wearing it or on the chest. And a lot of people used to think, these are fertility figurines, so that women would have babies. Well, come on, women have babies all the time. I don't think it was to encourage fertility, but it was to protect the mother during this, it's a very dangerous part of her life, especially when you get right to the birth event itself. So I think we had some magic going on, magic with animals, magic with people. We have what look like male figurines, and what they are used for, I don't know, what they represent. One of the interesting aspects about human figurines is that we had a single human figurine whose head was still attached to the rest of the figurine. And you remember, these people are being buried beneath the floors. Their skulls are removed and they become plastered. So there's some kind of special aspect to these people who get buried under the floor and their heads removed. Well, all of those human figurines, including those female figurines, the head is snapped off. And it kind of suggests, well, one or two things. One, that whatever the use of that figurine was, it belonged to the person who was wearing it. It's not something that just pass around. It's made for somebody, whether it's a male or a female. So it's not just personal property, but it's personal power. It's power that is for the person, not the rest of the people. So that's kind of intriguing, I think.
How many subfloor burials you and your team found in Ain Ghazal? Once we discussed this bizarre burial practices.
Yeah, I think the subfloor burials were only during the Middle PPNB at Ain Ghazal. In the area around Damascus, they were still doing this skull cult thing into the late PPNB as well. But in the south, south of Damascus, this was restricted to 8,400 to 7,500. And we got 68 burials from the middle PPNB, although that number wasn't entirely from beneath the floor. We had what looked like trash burials. Young adults, maybe a little, young adults, I think mostly, who when they died were literally thrown into the garbage. They dug a hole in a refuse pit, stuffed the people in there and covered them up. But that was only 3 out of how many people lived, how many thousand people lived during those 800 years of the middle PPNB. So I would say that we probably have something like 55 to 60 that were buried beneath the floors of houses. And it looks like we had one house that was occupied and renovated and reconstructed for 400 years based on C14 dates. And beneath the floors, we found 12 people. Now, if you divide 400 by 12, you get something like 36 or 37 years per burial. What does that sound like? Every 36 years. How old are you?
Yeah.
Something like one person per generation. So, everybody who lived in that house didn't get buried beneath the house. Just one person per generation was. And God knows what happened to the other 6 or 7 or 8 people in that family. There might be a cemetery out there somewhere, but nobody's found one for the middle PPNB anywhere. So I don't know. It's really strange.
You and your team also found the mass grave of those who were interred outside houses in the courtyard. And
well, they weren't mass graves. We found skulls sometimes. Yeah. There was one pit that had 4 skulls. And I think what that means is that, well, first of all, the skulls were not in very good condition. When they removed the skull, and they let all of they're probably scraping off the skin, scraping out the brains and whatever else is inside the skull. And then when they apply the plaster, there's a problem, and that is that the bone is still wet on the inside of the bone. In this bone structure itself, it's still wet. So when that starts drying out, it starts to get distorted. And if it distorts, it's breaking the plaster and it's falling off. So I think, when these plastered skulls were created shortly after death, maybe 1 or 2 years after death, they're placed on display somewhere in the house. And you might have your father's generation right next to your father's father's generation. You might have 3 or 4 skulls, 5 skulls or 6 skulls that go back to your great 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 grandfather or grandmother, all on display. But now some of them start to fall apart, and that's not nice to look at. So they get moved out, buried as if they, there are real people, and they are. Like those 4 skulls that we found in one pit, they're all looking towards in the same direction. That again, they're not just sort of being dumped in the hole. They're being placed very respectfully. But why they're looking towards the southwest, I have no idea.
And my last question is,
Yeah.
what are your plans for 2021? We finished with 2020, and do you plan to resume your activities in the Eastern Desert in 2020?
Yeah, we hope so. Yeah. It's not clear yet. I mean, nobody can predict what's going to go on, even with vaccines. We don't know how long the vaccine effect lasts. And we definitely want to go back out there, but we have to look at the potential legal problems. If we're going out there with students from universities, how can we guarantee that we won't be sued by their parents for taking them into some kind of dangerous situation? So, yeah, COVID is going to have lasting effects. If it looks like Jordan is no longer a hotspot, then we probably will go. We'd go out as soon as we could, like the end of May again. But otherwise, we might wait until September or October, hoping that the COVID thing resolves itself. But that's all we can say. I mean, it's still up in the air.
Yeah.
We hope is not necessarily what's going to happen.
Thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to seeing you again in Amman.
Okay.
I also hope that our viewers are going to like this conversation, and it's not going to be the last conversation. I have other questions for different researchers that you conducted for past 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gary.
Okay.
All the best.
Right. You too. Stay healthy.
I will.